Hi everyone. I'd like to walk you through a project that I worked on a bit over a year ago in which I used Python to build playlists in Spotify containing tracks from critically acclaimed albums as determined by the website Metacritic. For anyone who's unaware, Metacritic is a website which collects and aggregates critic reviews from a variety of sources in order to come up with a single Metascore. The goal of this project is to find all of the recently released albums with a Metascore above some threshold and maintain Spotify playlists containing the top tracks from these albums. Metacritic does not have a free public API, so I had to do some web scraping. Luckily, Metacritic does have this page where we have all of the recently released albums and their Metascores. This is where I grabbed the necessary Metacritic data from. Using these results, I then use the Spotify API to generate a playlist for the current month as well as for the previous month. These playlists are public and can be searched by anyone using the naming convention seen here. Let's take a look. This script will take each of the albums identified from Metacritic and will add the two most popular tracks, according to Spotify, to this playlist. Since the popularity of the album's tracks and the album's Metascore may fluctuate over time, I run this process daily and do a full replace of the current month and previous month's playlist. The script is hosted on Python Anywhere using a Python 2 virtual environment. It runs using a scheduled task, which kicks the script off daily. Let's take a look at the actual code. The main build playlist.py file is the main file which orchestrates the whole process. It imports from Metacritic scrape.py, which handles the web scraping, and Spotify playlist, which contains helper functions that work with the Spotify API. We also import Spotify credentials from a different file so that we don't include the sensitive credentials directly in the main file. Let's take a closer look at this main file. Let's skip to the input. The min score is just the minimum score an album must have in order to be added to the playlist. Num tracks is the number of tracks added from each album. And the timeout pause and timeout retries determines how this try-func function behaves. When making calls to the Spotify API, I noticed that I would often get server errors, so I wrap most of my Spotify calls in this try-func function in order to provide a throttling mechanism and a retry mechanism. Next, I iterate over the current and previous month. We start by calling this main scrape Metacritic function, which is imported from this Metacritic scrape file. This function will pull the raw HTML for the Metacritic page we were looking at earlier. I also pull the HTML for the second page just to make sure we're pulling everything. Metacritic really does not like too many calls being made to these web pages, so I save the HTML as a file so I can quickly load it up while doing development and troubleshooting. We can open up the HTML that we pull, but it's not very easy to see much structure from this view. If we go to the web page instead and inspect, we can see the structure much more clearly. This class named product release product is the parent class which each of our albums live in. And if we expand this, we can find the album name. We can find the Metascore. And if we expand these stats, we see the artist name here, as well as the release date. So each of these fields have a unique class name, which will be helpful for us when using the Beautiful Soup library to parse through this HTML. I then use Beautiful Soup to generate a list of all of the album's parent elements, and then search within each of those elements to find the values which corresponds to each of the class names which we've pointed out earlier. Based on whether or not the album meets the minimum threshold and was released during the targeted month, this album will get added to a list which will then be used to generate a CSV containing the following information. Jumping back to the main script, we're now ready to start working with the Spotify API. We start by generating a fresh access token using the credential variables we've imported from the special credentials file. We then search for an existing playlist using the naming convention referred to earlier. If we don't find an existing playlist with that name, we create one. We then use this delete PL tracks function to clear out any tracks that are currently in that playlist. Remember, we want to do a full replace of the playlist each time the script runs. Those three functions are pretty straightforward and can be found in the Spotify playlist file. Next, we load in that CSV file we generated using the Metacritic data. For each album in that file, we attempt to find a corresponding album ID using the Spotify API. This getAlbumID function will take the album name from Metacritic and use Spotify's search engine to search for that album. If we find a result with the same album name and same artist name as the results we got from Metacritic, we will return that album ID as an album which we will be adding to our playlist. If an album ID is returned, we'll then feed that album ID to this last function, which adds top tracks from that album to the playlist. This function will retrieve all the tracks that belong to the album we provide, and then it will retrieve stats around those tracks, and it will identify the two tracks with the highest popularity score as determined by Spotify. It will then add these two tracks to the playlist. It does this for each album. And that's it. I will say this has been one of my favorite projects to work on, mainly because it has fully automated something that I personally spent a lot of time on doing manually in the past. These playlists have been my go-to source for new music for over a year now and will likely continue to be in the future. One thing that I would like to add to this tool is a fuzzy matching capability when searching for albums within Spotify. Like I said, currently we only add albums if there is an exact match between Metacritic and Spotify, so it would be cool to do some kind of fuzzy matching to get those that have slight differences. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and feel free to check out the playlists. Cheers.